At 71 years old, after designing roads and bridges that survived decades of brutal winters, I've come to realize the greatest mistake a provider can make is turning his own spine into a floor for his family to walk on. When you bend down for too long to carry them without asking for anything in return, they stop seeing your sacrifice. To them, you simply become a part of the architecture under their boots. That realization arrived through a cold, unhurried voice over the receiver at exactly 8:14 on a Tuesday morning. My oldest boy, Lucas, didn't ask how my breathing was. He just cleared his throat and delivered a sentence he'd already polished. "Dad, you need to be out of the Kettner cabin by the end of the month. We've made a decision. We're listing the property." He thought an old man was a simple calculation, someone you could cross out with a real estate listing and a deadline. But he forgot that a man who spends his life planning foundations doesn't just build things, he plans for the storm. That morning, I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't threaten him. I simply let the silence stretch, because I knew a secret that would shift the earth beneath his feet. Stay with me, because this isn't a story about a bitter father seeking a loud revenge. It is a lesson in how a quiet retreat can execute the heaviest form of justice. Every home has shadows that outsiders never see, and every family ledger eventually demands a balance. If you are here searching for the quiet truth of self-respect and the resilience of a father's heart, take a brief moment to subscribe to the channel. Let us turn the pages of this memory together. A man who spends 40 years working with raw cement, structural iron, and drafting paper learns a simple truth early on. If the foundation is off by even half an inch, the entire bridge will eventually tear itself apart under its own weight. I spent my youth building the overpasses and county roads that cut through the valley of Bayfield. I knew how much load a steel beam could carry before it started to buckle, and I knew how to read the hidden shifts in the soil. My hands were permanently rough, smelling of engine grease and river mud, but back then, the work felt solid. It had a purpose. My late wife, Elena, was the quiet center of that purpose. We didn't have much when we started out in the early 80s. Just an old Ford truck and a small rented split level on Harmon Ridge Road. But we had a clear understanding of what mattered. In 1993, I took a gamble that made the folks down at the local grain elevator whisper that I'd completely lost my senses. I spent $32,000, every single dime we had tucked away in our savings, on a wild, overgrown patch of timber right on the shore of Kettner Lake, 14 miles northwest of town. It was just rocks, dense briars, and mosquitoes back then. People told me the ground was too stubborn to clear, that the clay would wash out, and that I was throwing my life away on a swamp. Elena just looked at the water, wiped the dirt off my cheek, and handed me a ham sandwich. That was her way of saying she trusted the blueprint. I built that cabin piece by piece over 3 long summers. I hauled every single cedar log out of the back of my truck, notched the corners with a hand axe, and raised the roof beams using nothing but a manual winch and my own shoulders. Lucas was 9 that first summer, and Thomas was 6. I can still see them running around in the sawdust, their bare feet covered in wood shavings, constantly losing my tape measures and handing me crooked nails from an old coffee can. We didn't have electricity out there for the first 2 years. We lived by the light of kerosene lamps and cooked our meals over an open fire pit by the shore. It was hard, lean living, but it was ours. When Elena got sick in 2014, that cabin became our sanctuary. We spent her very last good summer sitting out on that eastern dock. We didn't talk much about what was coming. When you've been married 30 years, you don't need a lot of words to fill the spaces. We just watched the loons dive under the water and listened to the wind rustling through the birch trees. After she passed away in the spring of 2015, that wood and stone became holy ground to me. It was the one place where the air still held her warmth, where I could look out over the morning mist and still hear the soft, clear sound of her laughter echoing off the shoreline. But time has a way of working on a family, slowly, the way rust quietly eats through a solid steel fence without you noticing until the entire structure is compromised. Lucas, my oldest, never cared for the dirt or the timber. He inherited a different kind of hunger, fast-moving, impatient, always looking for a shortcut that didn't require calluses on his palms. He moved down to Madison, trying to reinvent himself as an independent commercial broker, but his ledger was always a disaster of unpaid debts and bad timing. He married a woman named Channing, who possessed an expensive appetite for a lifestyle they hadn't earned yet. She looked at our family dinners, not as a tradition, but as an inconvenience, and she eyed my property with a cold, calculated interest that made my stomach turn. Then there was Thomas, my youngest. Good-natured, quiet Thomas, who still had his mother's soft eyes but lacked the spine to stand his ground. He stayed closer to home, but he lived in Lucas's shadow, constantly nodding along with his older brother's grand schemes because the thought of an argument made him physically uncomfortable. The first real cracks appeared during our Thanksgiving dinner a few years back. Lucas didn't ask about how my joints were holding up under the winter freeze. Instead, he kept steering the conversation toward property valuations, asset management, and what my long-term plans were for the Kettner acreage. He spoke with a little too much enthusiasm, his fingers tapping nervously against his wine glass while Channing watched me from across the table like a hawk. I noticed the shift. I knew the look of a man who was already doing the math on another man's life. I just chose to hold my tongue and pass the gravy. When a man hits his late 60s, he starts thinking about how to smooth the road for the people he's leaving behind. You want to make sure the foundation you built doesn't crumble into a legal mess when your breath finally leaves your chest. So, in the winter of 2019, I walked down to the county recorder's office and added both Lucas and Thomas to the deed of the Kettner Lake property as co-owners. I thought it was an act of protection. I thought I was wrapping my arms around my boys, ensuring they would always have a place to bring their own children to see the water. I didn't realize I was handing them the crowbar they would use to pry the roof off my life. The real storm rolled in 2 days before that cold Tuesday morning deadline. It was a Sunday, the kind of gray, heavy Wisconsin morning where the fog sits so thick on the fields you'd swear it was paying rent. I was standing in my kitchen, waiting for the coffee pot to finish brewing, when the phone rang. The screen showed Lucas's name. "Hey, Dad," he said when I picked up. His voice had that careful, deliberate cadence, the exact tone he used when he'd rehearsed a speech in front of a mirror. "Lucas," I said, leaning my hip against the counter. "You're up early for a Sunday." "Yeah, well, things are moving fast down here," he muttered, and then he cleared his throat. That specific, dry scratch in his throat. I've known that sound since he was 16 years old and had to come into the workshop to confess he'd dented the oil pan on my work truck. It was the sound of a boy hiding a fracture. "Listen, Dad, Thomas and I have been talking about the Kettner place." I set my mug down on the counter, very slow, letting the ceramic click against the laminate. "What about it, son?" "Well, look, you're 71 now," he started, his voice gaining that slick, salesman momentum he learned in Madison. "You're up there alone most weekends. The county property taxes just jumped another 12%, and the maintenance is getting out of hand. I mean, when's the last time you even checked the cedar siding on the north wall? Or replaced that rotted dock section on the east side?" "I replaced that dock section last April, Lucas." "With my own hands," I said, my voice completely flat, completely even. "Say what you came to say." Another throat clear rattled through the receiver. "Thomas and I think it's time to sell it, Dad. It just makes financial sense. The lakefront market up there is completely insane right now." We found an agent out of Pewaukee, a guy named Mark Benson. He's done a full assessment. He thinks we could list it at $390,000, maybe more. I stood in the quiet of my kitchen, listening to my oldest boy talk about my life as if it were a used car he was trying to flip before the transmission went out. "We found an agent," I repeated, letting the words sit between us like cold grease. "When exactly did you derrick an agent into my business without telling me?" "Lucas?" Silence came over the line, the thick, heavy kind of silence that happens when a man realizes he's stepped over a boundary he can't walk back across. "Dad, don't be like that," he stammered, his slick tone cracking at the edges. "We just wanted to get all the information together before we brought it to you, so you'd have the full picture. It's for your own good. Channing says the upkeep is just a liability for a man your age. And Thomas is on board with this?" I asked. "Yeah, we both think it's the right move. We're aligned on this. Dad, put him on," I said. "What? Put Thomas on the phone, Lucas, right now." I heard the rustle of the receiver being shifted, the muffled sound of a hand covering the mouthpiece, and a hurried, tense argument in the background. Then, Thomas's voice came through, smaller than usual, already weighted down with an apology before he even finished his first word. "Hey, Dad," he whispered. "Thomas," I said, looking out at the fog on Harmon Ridge Road. "Was this your idea?" A long, suffocating pause stretched out. I could hear him breathing, shaky and uncertain. "I mean, we talked about it together, Dad. Lucas says the market won't stay this high forever, and with Channing's new project and my truck payments, financially, it could really clear things up for all of us. Lucas says you're getting too old to handle the snow up there anyway." I picked my coffee cup back up and took one quiet sip. "I've heard everything I need to hear from both of you," I said. "Dad, don't just hang up," Thomas started, but I didn't let him finish the sentence. I clicked the phone off and set it down next to the bread box. I walked back out to the porch and sat in my old wooden chair for 40 minutes. Just me, the cold wind coming off the ridge, and a crow sitting on the fence line. I wasn't angry yet. A man who spent his life engineering bridges doesn't waste his energy on rage. He looks at the stress points. But I was devastated. 71 years old, and the boys I had raised with every ounce of sweat in these calloused hands had gone behind my back, hired a stranger from Pewaukee, and decided how to clear away the one place that held their mother's ghost. They thought because my bones were old, my eyes were blind to the math they were running. They didn't know that while they were busy looking at the Kettner deed, they had completely missed the real foundation. A lot of people think an engineer only looks at what is visible above the dirt, the concrete pillars, the steel trusses, the paved lanes. But any man who has spent his youth moving earth will tell you that the real strength of a structure lies in what remains completely hidden beneath the surface. You plan for the shifting of the clay, you plan for the frost heaves, and most importantly, you plan for the unexpected failure of the beams you thought would hold the load. When I hung up the phone after that Sunday conversation, the devastation didn't paralyze me. It cleared my vision. I walked inside, went into my small workshop room, and opened the bottom desk drawer. The one my late Elena used to call my serious drawer because nothing light or trivial ever came out of it. I reached all the way to the back and pulled out a manila folder that hadn't been touched in 7 years. Inside was a certified deed with a heavy gold seal from the county recorder's office. But the address on it didn't say Kettner Lake. In April of 2016, exactly 6 months after the cancer took Elena and left my world entirely quiet, I took a long drive northeast with no destination. I found myself 43 miles away from Bayfield, on the elevated western bluff of Garrison Lake. A small, deep body of water surrounded by state-protected timberlands that didn't show up on commercial tourist maps. There was an old, beautiful timber lodge sitting on a 3-acre corner lot, featuring a massive fieldstone fireplace and a wraparound porch that faced dead west into the horizon. I bought it outright for $260,000 using the insurance policy and the savings Elena and I had quietly accumulated over 30 years of driving used trucks and repairing our own shingles. I didn't tell my boys. I didn't tell a single soul except my old friend Silas Vance, the retired county recorder. I placed that entire multi-acre property inside an irrevocable trust, the Elena Vega Family Trust, naming myself as the lifetime beneficiary with strict instructions that the land could never be divided, mortgaged, or listed on an open market. For 7 long years, Lucas and his wife Channing sat at my Thanksgiving table, whispering to Thomas, eyeing the small Kettner cabin like a piece of meat they were entitled to carve up, completely blind to the fact that the real prize, a pristine fortress of stone and timber, was sitting 43 miles away, waiting patiently in the dark. Then came that Tuesday morning call at exactly 8:14. Lucas didn't raise his voice this time. His voice had the cold, sharp edge of a man who believed the closing papers were already in his pocket. "Dad," he said, "we've made our decision and we've already signed the listing agreement with Mark Benson. The buyers are ready. We're doing this with or without your signature, so you need to have your tools and your clothes out of Kettner by the end of the month." I let the silence settle over the line, listening to the shallow, arrogant rhythm of his breathing. I leaned back in my chair, letting the old wood creak softly in the morning frost, and I spoke with the calm of a Sunday morning. "Lucas, son, which cabin do you think your old father is calling you from right now?" The closing was set for 9 o'clock on a bitter Monday morning, December 3rd, at the title office in Delafield. A clean, white-walled room where large sums of family money changed hands with very little ceremony. I drove down from the ridge early, securing my seat in the corner before anyone else arrived. Lucas walked in at 3 minutes to 9, practically radiating the confidence of a man who believed he had successfully outmaneuvered his old man. He looked at my worn canvas jacket, my worn work boots, and he smiled that slick Madison smile, thinking I had showed up out of fear, or perhaps because I was too old and senile to find my way around the county paperwork without him. He crossed the room with his hand extended. "Glad you made it, Dad. We're just smoothing out the formalities so we can get this wrapped up for the Marshes." I shook his hand, told him I wouldn't miss it for the world, and went back to sipping my cold coffee. The title officer, a woman named Paula, began stacking the transfer documents in the center of the table. Mark Benson uncapped his gold pen, handing it toward Ted Marsh, who was leaning forward with the eager energy of a man about to secure his weekend retreat. Lucas relaxed visibly, the tension dropping completely from his shoulders as he reached for the first page. At exactly 9:04, the old phone in my jacket pocket buzzed once. It was a short text message from Raymond Castillo, my estate attorney. "Ready when you are, Master Vega." I stood up from my corner chair. Every single head at that long mahogany table turned to look at me. Paula stopped sorting the carbon copies. "Master Vega?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "Is there a problem? I apologize to everyone in this room," I said, my voice completely steady, completely unhurried. "But there is a call that needs to be taken before anyone signs their name to that paper. Mark Benson, my attorney Raymond Castillo, is on the line, and he specifically needs to speak with you." Benson blinked, a small, patronizing smirk forming on his face. "Master Vega, we're in the middle of a legal closing. If your attorney has questions about the commission percentages, he can call our main brokerage office on Tuesday. He doesn't have questions about commissions, Mr. Benson." "Mester," I said, setting my foam cup down with a soft thud. "He has questions about your real estate license. Take the phone." The tone in my voice, the quiet, absolute authority of a man who had commanded 100-man construction crews for 40 years, made the smirk vanish from the agent's face. He slowly reached out and took the phone from my hand. I stood there, watching his eyes as Raymond's voice came through the speaker. I watched the confident color slowly drain from his cheeks. I watched his fingers loosen around his gold pen until it dropped onto the mahogany table. "Say that again," Benson whispered into the receiver, his jaw tightening so hard the muscles in his cheek began to twitch. "Are you certain?" He listened for another 10 seconds, then slowly lowered the phone, looking at Lucas with a gaze that was cold enough to freeze water. "Matt Vega," Benson said, and he was addressing Lucas now, completely ignoring me. "This closing cannot proceed. The listing is dead." Ted Marsh's chair scraped violently back against the linoleum floor as he stood up, his face turning an angry shade of crimson. "What the hell do you mean it can't proceed? We've been under contract for 3 weeks. We paid $400 for an appraisal, $700 for a structural inspection, and my kids have already told their friends they're spending Christmas at the lake. You told us the family was completely aligned. The transaction is legally unenforceable. Master Marsh," Benson stammered, his professional composure shattering into pieces right in front of his buyers. "The property deed has a multi-party co-ownership clause recorded under Wisconsin statute. A transfer of title requires the unanimous, verified written consent of all listed owners at the time of listing. Bradley Vega entered into a commercial purchase agreement on an asset he lacked the unilateral authority to sell. This office cannot clear the title." The room erupted into a chaos of scraping chairs, angry mutters, and cell phones being pulled out to contact corporate lawyers. Ted Marsh turned on Lucas with the flat, dangerous eyes of a man who realized he had been dragged into a fraudulent mess. Thomas put his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking as he realized the weight of what his brother had led him into. But Lucas just sat there in his fine navy jacket, staring at the blank signature lines on the contract, as if the ink might magically appear to save him. He slowly turned his head toward me, his face pale, his mouth slightly open like a fish gasping for air. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking like a boy who had broken something he could never replace. "What did you do? Why did you let it get all the way to this table?" I looked down at my oldest son, letting the heavy silence do the work that anger never could. "Because, Lucas," I said quietly, "you needed to see the full weight of the floor you thought you were standing on. When your lifelong kindness is taken as a stepping stone, you are left with a quiet choice. Do you exhaust yourself screaming into the wind, or do you step back and let them crash into the very wall they spent years building? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. When the storm finally clears out of a room, it leaves behind a very specific kind of vacuum. The strangers from Chicago pack their briefcases. The frantic phone calls in the hallway fade into silence, and the real estate agent scurries out the back door to save what is left of his brokerage firm. What you are left with is just the bloodline. The people who share your last name, sitting under the cold, unblinking glare of fluorescent lights, waiting for the numbers to settle. I sat at the head of that table, looking at my boys. Lucas was 39, still wearing that fine navy blue suit jacket, but the arrogance had completely drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, hollow mask. Thomas sat next to him, his fingers knotted together so tightly his knuckles were white, staring down at the floorboards because he couldn't bear to meet my eyes. For 40 years, I had commanded crews on massive construction projects, and I knew how to read the structural integrity of a man just by watching how he stood under weight. Right then, both of my sons looked like beams that had completely snapped under the load of their own impatience. They weren't the fast-talking operators from Madison or the local providers anymore. They were just two boys caught in a lie, waiting for their father to lay out the final blueprint. I didn't raise my voice. A man who has spent his life working with stone and structural steel knows that shouting doesn't make a pillar any stronger. It just reveals the fracture. I unbuttoned my canvas jacket, reached into the breast pocket, and pulled out a fresh manila envelope. I slid it across the mahogany table until it landed with a dull thud right between them. "Open it, Lucas," I said, my voice completely level, completely unhurried. Lucas's fingers shook as he reached out and slid the document from the paper sleeve. It was a certified decree, stamped and recorded at the county courthouse at exactly 3:15 the previous afternoon. As he read the legal description of the property, I watched his jaw go completely slack. What is this?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "That is the updated title deed for the Kettner Lake property," I said, leaning forward so we were eye to eye. "When I added both of your names to that deed back in 2019, I included a standard structural clause under our family estate agreement. A clause that strictly stated that any attempt by a co-owner to unilaterally encumber, mortgage, or list the asset for sale without unanimous written consent would constitute a material breach of the trust. Yesterday afternoon, Judge Miller signed the reversion order. Both of your names have been legally stripped from that title. The Kettner cabin belongs solely to me now. You don't own a single grain of sand on that shoreline. It is no longer yours to inherit, and it is certainly no longer yours to sell." Dead, flat silence rushed into the room, so thick you could hear the air vents humming overhead. Thomas let out a ragged, trembling breath, a single tear cutting through the dust on his cheek. But I wasn't finished. I reached back into my jacket and pulled out the second folder, the one from my serious drawer that held the gold seal of the Elena Vega Family Trust. I laid it flat on the wood, smoothing the parchment with my thinned, calloused hand, and I slid it over next to the title deed. "Now, let's look at the real math, boys," I said, my tone as cold and steady as the deep water of the Mississippi. "For 7 years, you've been coming up to Kettner, looking at the cedar siding, looking at the dock, running the numbers on how much cash you could squeeze out of your mother's memory. You thought that small cabin was the only prize. You thought your old father was just an outdated engineer sitting out his days on an old porch. You were so busy scheming behind my back that you never bothered to look 43 miles northeast. I opened the ledger, revealing the official independent appraisal from last month. This is the lodge at Garrison Lake. 3 acres of old-growth timber, a stone fireplace built from river rock, and 500 feet of deep waterfront facing the western horizon. Last month, Raymond's appraisers valued the estate at $1.1 million. I watched the numbers land on their faces like a physical strike. Lucas actually gasped, his eyes darting from the gold seal to the valuation row, his mind frantically trying to calculate a wealth he didn't even know existed. "I bought that lodge in 2016 because I needed a place that still smelled like your mother," I continued, my voice dropping lower, vibrating through the hollow mahogany table. "A place where no one could put a commercial price tag on my piece. but my intention was always to leave it to you when my breath finally left my chest. It was written in the original trust agreement, divided equally between my two sons, $5,500,000 each. That was your true inheritance. That was the security your mother and I spent 30 years of lean living to build for you. I reached out and turned the final page of the trust document, pointing directly to the amendment section signed by Raymond Castillo. But you got impatient, Lucas. You let Channing's expensive taste and your bad broker debts steer you into a dark corner. And you, Thomas, you let your brother hand you a pen because you were too cowardly to stand up for what was right. You signed a listing agreement behind my back. You brought a stranger into my business, and you called me on a Tuesday morning to give me a deadline to get off my own land. I let the silence stretch for 5 full seconds, forcing them to look at the massive gulf between the two ledger rows. You were willing to sell Kettner Lake for $382,000. Split 2 ways after Mark Benson took his cut, you were chasing a quick $191,000 each. You were so eager to grab that handful of silver that you rushed the timeline, violated the bloodline, and walked right into a checkmate. I tapped my finger against the amendment page. As of yesterday afternoon, the successor beneficiary designations for the Elena Vega Family Trust have been permanently altered. When I pass, the Garrison Lake Lodge does not go to the Vega name. The entire $1 million estate transfers directly to the land conservation nonprofit out of Madison. They will keep those waters wild and accessible to the public forever. You threw away a $1.1 million legacy, just to try and steal $191,000 from an old man. Thomas made a low, choking sound in his throat. Not a word, just the raw, guttural noise of a man hitting a concrete floor he never saw coming. He dropped his forehead onto his folded hands, his frame shaking violently as he sobbed into the empty wood. Lucas didn't make a sound at all. He just stood there, staring at the appraisal document, his mouth opening and closing as his brain finally forced him to do the math he should have done before he ever picked up the phone. The arrogance in his fine navy jacket was completely gone, replaced by the crushing, heavy realization that his own greed had just dismantled his children's future. I didn't say these things to twist the knife, and I didn't do it to feel the cheap thrill of vindication. A provider doesn't seek revenge. He administers consequences. They needed to feel the exact weight of the structure they had ruptured, and they needed to understand that when you cut the pillars out from under your father's house, the roof falls on your own shoulders. I stood up, buttoned my canvas jacket, and packed my coffee cup away, leaving my 2 grown sons sitting alone in the cold rubble of their own math. A structural fracture in a bridge doesn't always happen because the steel was weak. Sometimes, it happens because the builders got too impatient and rushed the load before the concrete could fully set. I stood at the head of that empty table, looking down at the 2 men I had raised with every ounce of sweat in my bones, and I let the silence do the teaching. I didn't hide the lodge at Garrison Lake to hand you a punishment. Boys, I said, my voice carrying the slow, gentle cadence of a Sunday morning. I bought that dirt because it was the only place left on this earth that still held your mother's shape. I wanted to protect it from the noise of the world. My blueprint was always to leave it to the both of you, divided down the middle when my eyes finally closed for good. But you were both in such a hurry to count numbers that hadn't been earned yet. You rushed the timeline, you went behind my back, and you cut down the very pillars holding up your own roof. The real math of life doesn't stay on a yellow legal pad. It walks out into the world as a consequence. Lucas sat frozen, the gold watch on his wrist suddenly looking very heavy as he realized the full weight of the fracture. Mark Benson's real estate agency was already structuring the breach of contract paperwork. Lucas was looking down the barrel of a $21,000 settlement to cover the Marsh's legal fees, appraisal costs, and structural inspections. And back in Madison, Channing was already packing her bags, her expensive appetite unable to survive the cold reality of a depleted bank account and a ruined credit line. But it was Thomas who broke completely. He didn't look at the appraisal folder, and he didn't check the numbers. He just buried his face in his rough hands, his shoulders shaking violently as he wept into the hollow wood of the table. He wasn't crying for the loss of $1 million inheritance. He was crying because he looked into the mirror and finally saw the truth. He realized he had let his brother hand him a pen to sign away the pride of the father who had knelt in the sawdust 40 years ago, patiently teaching his tiny hands how to drive his very first row of nails. I didn't reach into my pocket to write a check to clear Lucas's debt, and I didn't take Thomas's hand to tell him everything was fine. A father who loves his sons doesn't carry their bricks when the wall they built starts to lean. I simply buttoned my canvas jacket, picked up my old car keys, and stepped toward the door. They are 39 and 36 years old. Grown men who need to learn how to walk on rough ground without their father holding up the pavement. I left them alone in the quiet room to figure out how to navigate the hard road they had paved with their own choices. The land doesn't care about market values or real estate brokers. It only remembers the resilience of the hands that tended it. There are things in this life that can never be appraised, and a father's self-respect is one of them. Thank you for sitting out here on the ridge with me tonight, and for listening to an old man's memory. If this story brought a bit of clear logic to your own path, please take a moment to like the video, share it, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next quiet journey into the values that endure. Let me know in the comments below what town or city you are listening from tonight. Sleep well, my friends, and keep your foundations deep.